Aston Martin, which is well known for its V8 and V12 sports cars, began selling in 2011 a small city car equipped with a 1.3-liter four-cylinder engine, generating only 97 horsepower. The car cost about £31,000, took approximately 11.8 seconds to go from 0 to 62 miles per hour, and beneath the Aston Martin grille, with its leather and badges, was actually a Toyota IQ that cost about a third as much. Aston Martin was not intending to sell a few hundred as part of some limited experiment. It was reported to receive about 4,000 Cygnets each year, which at the time was an extremely large figure. So what caused a company which had been based on producing expensive V8 and V12 cars to suddenly need tens of thousands of small Toyotas? In 2007, Ford disposed of its stake in Aston Martin for £479 million, thus making the company independent once more. However, this independence brought about a problem. While under Ford, Aston Martin had been part of a group that sold a range of vehicles from small economy cars to V12 Grand Tours, its own range now consisted almost entirely of cars with large engines and very high CO2 emissions. The timing was absolutely the worst it could have been. The European Union had introduced new regulations designed at getting average new car emissions down to 130 grams of CO2 per kilometer. Aston Martin's figures were a long way from meeting this target. The V8 Vantage amounted to about 328 grams per kilometer, and the V12 DBS was roughly 388. Then how could Aston Martin reduce that average? There was the possibility of selling a vehicle at the other end of its range. A small and efficient car could lower the average figure for the fleet without it being necessary for Aston Martin to replace the V8s and V12s, which made up its current range. The issue was, however, that Aston Martin did not have a small car, and to develop a completely new platform, engine, and safety package for such a car would take both money and time. What Aston Martin did instead was to select a car which had already been developed, the manufacturer of which was Toyota. The relationship began in 2009 at the 24 Hours of Nürburgring, where both Ulrich Bez, who was the CEO of Aston Martin, and Akio Toyoda, who was president of Toyota, were competing, and their teams used the same pit garage. Because Bez showed an interest in Toyota's new IQ, talks between the two companies started just a few days later. But why the IQ? Even though the car was less than 3 meters in length, Toyota had designed it so as to accommodate 3 adults and a child through an unusual 3+1 seating arrangement. More importantly for Aston Martin, the hard and costly work had already been carried out since Toyota had developed the platform, the engine, and the safety systems, and the car was already in production. Aston Martin had no need to start from scratch in designing a city car, since Toyota could have just manufactured the IQ in Japan and then send the finished cars to Britain. When they had reached the Aston Martin factory in Gaydon, they were taken apart once more. But Aston Martin wasn't rebuilding the entire car. The basic chassis, front-wheel drive layout, suspension architecture, and Toyota powertrain remained, which also meant Aston avoided developing and crash testing an entirely new city car. Most of its work could instead be concentrated on the parts customers would actually see and touch. When the cars got to Gaydon, Aston Martin invested about 150 hours in modifying each one. The exterior was given a new bonnet, Aston's characteristic aluminum grille, different body panels and detailing, and the cars could be painted in the same facilities that are used for the £1 million 177. Inside, much of the Toyota interior was either replaced or had materials typical of those used in Aston's more expensive cars placed over it. The materials included hand-stitched leather, Alcantara, machined aluminium, and extra sound insulation, and customers had the option of extensively customizing the colors and materials. Yet mechanically, hardly anything changed. The Cygnet continued to use the 1.33-liter engine that produced 97 brake horsepower, driving the front wheels via either a 6-speed manual gearbox or a CVT, and it still took about 11.8 seconds to reach 62 miles per hour. Then how much did Aston Martin ask for all that extra work? About £31,000. A similar Toyota IQ would cost about £10,000 to £12,000, so Aston Martin was requesting nearly 3 times as much, even though the engine and the basic drivetrain had been left essentially unchanged. At first, Aston didn't intend to offer it to everybody. The plan was to present the Cygnet MA The target customer was important since Aston Martin was not viewing the Cygnet as a cheap way of getting into the brand. According to Ulrich Bez, the concept was akin to placing a tender for a luxury yacht, whereby owners could keep their V8 or V12 Aston for longer trips while using the Cygnet in cities such as London, Paris, Rome, or Milan. Yet Aston Martin had expected this idea to be very widely successful. The company was said to have aimed at selling about 4,000 Cygnet cars each year. To put this into context, Aston Martin's total annual production at that time was only about 4,000 to 6,000 vehicles, which meant that the Cygnet alone was intended to bring about a large increase in sales volume. There was one other reason why selling thousands of low-emission Cygnets might be useful. Since each of them emitted approximately 110 to 116 grams of CO2 per kilometer, they could help reduce the carbon output of an Aston Martin fleet, which consisted mainly of cars producing well above 300 grams. Actually, did Aston Martin need the Cygnet in order to meet the European emissions rules? By no means, since the regulations included an important exception which completely complicates the usual reason for the existence of this car. A special emissions target was available to small volume manufacturers. Manufacturers who produce fewer than 10,000 cars per year could apply for this special emissions target rather than being dealt with as if they were companies selling millions of cars. Aston Martin managed to qualify, and in 2011, it submitted an application for this derogation. The European Commission then agreed to a company-specific target according to which Aston would reduce its average emissions by about 40 grams of CO2 per kilometer between 2010 and 2016. It was not the case that Aston Martin was simply having to choose between selling thousands of Cygnets or finding some way of reducing its entire V8 and V12 range to 130 grams per kilometer. That then raises a clear question. If Aston Martin had been able to obtain a special target, why was it selling the Cygnet at all? The timing accounts for part of the explanation. Although the Cygnet project began in 2009, Aston's particular derogation wasn't approved until later. Yet emissions had never been the only consideration behind the car. Ulrich Bez genuinely thought there was a market for a small luxury Aston that its existing customers could use in busy cities. By the time the regulatory pressure had softened, Aston Martin still had another reason for carrying on. It thought that people would actually buy the car. All it now required was for 4,000 customers each year to turn up. Those customers never arrived. Production started in 2011, but rather than selling 4,000 Cygnets each year, Aston Martin managed to produce fewer than 800 throughout the entire duration of the model's availability. Different sources give slightly different estimates, although 786 is the figure most frequently cited, and in any case, the discrepancy was huge. The company had hoped to sell several thousand every 12 months, and in fact, never reached a total of 1,000. You will also come across statements saying that only about 150 Cygnets were built. This figure is mainly based on data from UK registrations, not on the total number produced worldwide, and therefore greatly underestimates the actual number constructed. Sales were so weak that Aston Martin eventually abandoned another element of the first strategy. Although the Cygnet had originally been intended for existing Aston Martin customers, the company later made its sales available to people who did not already own an Aston Martin. That is why they couldn't sell it. It was a major issue. Even though the car's engine, drivetrain, and fundamental structure were still based on a Toyota that cost about 1/3 as much, buyers were being asked to pay more than £30,000. Furthermore, although Aston had carried out about 150 hours of work on the materials, the exterior and the interior, this did not affect the 97 horsepower engine or the time of roughly 11.8 seconds to reach 62 miles per hour. Production at Aston Martin came to a stop by 2013. When production had stopped 5 years earlier, the Cygnet came back, but this time Aston Martin took out the part which had originally given the vehicle its usefulness with regard to emissions, the small Toyota engine. In 2018, a customer asked Aston Martin's Q division to construct a one-off V8 Cygnet at the same time as the engineers substituted the 1.33-liter four-cylinder engine with the naturally aspirated 4.7-liter V8 from the Vantage S, which gave a power output of 430 horsepower. The car was also changed change from front-wheel to rear-wheel drive, and a new transmission tunnel, altered subframes, vantage suspension and brakes, wider wheel arches, and a roll cage were needed in order to strengthen the small chassis. The result was said to attain 60 miles per hour after about 4.2 seconds and had a claimed maximum speed of about 170 miles per hour. Then why did Aston Martin sell a Toyota? The reason was that once it had become independent, Aston Martin's range, which had been dominated by V8 and V12 engines, came up against ever more stringent emission regulations, and so Toyota supplied Aston with a small car that had already been developed, rather than having to design one from scratch. At the same time, Ulrich Bez thought that Aston's present customers would be willing to pay for a luxury car for use in the city, which is why the company anticipated selling thousands of them even apart from the advantages offered by the regulations. Aston was eventually given a special emission target, whereas the commercial part of the plan very badly failed to meet expectations. Production of the regular Cygnets had not reached 800 before it came to an end in 2013. The last version increased the output from 97 horsepower of the initial Toyota to 430. Thanks for watching.